life of artist Frank Duveneck, looking across the years, appears like a map of randomly scattered coordinates. Duveneck was born in 1848 in Covington, Kentucky, just across the Ohio River from Cincinnati. His German immigrant family ran a beer garden from his childhood home. By 24, the artist had acquired great acclaim in Europe for the luminous darks and lights in his old master-style portraits, in his ability to capture a subject's penetrating humanity, and the juiciness, as they said, of his brushwork. The painter Carl Sampson described Duveneck's uncanny ability to indicate maximum form and volume with an extraordinary economy of means. Every brushstroke is loaded with purpose and resolve. Henry James, the novelist and perhaps a romantic rival, described Duveneck as an unsuspected genius, but also called him a brawling illiterate with whom he was unable to have a conversation for more than 2 minutes. Upon sitting for a portrait, Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman physician in the United States, bemoaned Duveneck's poor grammar and lack of formal education, but declared her portrait, sadly lost today, a work of art, and suggested to her daughter she would like to adopt the painter. Europe was Duveneck's studio in his youth, and a band of devoted students anointed the Duveneck boys happily trailed him from Cincinnati and across the continent. Student Frank Cadogan Cowper said of their teacher, "He was adored by all who knew him, very sincere but charitable in his criticisms, and devoid of that sarcasm that geniuses so often affect." The artist's late paintings, considered some of his most beautiful, were impressionistic, even modernistic views of Gloucester, Massachusetts. Duveneck is now credited with being one of the founders of the Cape Ann art colony. Scattered coordinates on the map of a man raised by recent immigrants, with the talent to soar in a realm populated by the wealthy and educated, Duveneck's positive, inclusive view of the world made him a beloved teacher. But ultimately, his life was radically altered by events he could not control. In the context of the people he loved, the coordinates of Duveneck's life make sense. Duveneck's mother had worked as a domestic for the Cincinnati portrait artist James Henry Beard. From him, she learned the profound importance of art and would later encourage her eldest son to become an artist. Young Duveneck showed talent and eventually apprenticed with church painter Wilhelm Lamprecht to embellish Benedictine monasteries along the eastern seaboard. The Benedictine order actually encouraged Duveneck to study at the Royal Academy in Munich. There, he transitioned to easel painting, studying in the class of Wilhelm von Dietz, who encouraged close examination of the old masters, but also personal expression. Quoted as admiring the work of the French artist Jean-François Millet, saying his subjects were real people who had work to do. Duveneck was also drawn to the working class, particularly the very old and the young. Duveneck's most famous painting from these early years, and in fact over his lifetime, remains The Whistling Boy, a portrait of a lively young Munich urchin, as spirited and human a portrayal as a Velázquez, to whom Duveneck was often compared in those years. Duveneck returned to Cincinnati from Munich in 1883 and found an advocate in the New England painter William Morris Hunt, who encouraged Duveneck to exhibit in Boston. In his Boston studio, Hunt was one of the few artists who took women on as students. One of those students was Elizabeth Boot, heiress to a textile fortune. The Boots were truly New England aristocrats, friendly with Ralph Waldo Emerson, the Lowells, and the family of Henry James, who based at least 2 of his novels on Elizabeth, or Lizzie, and her father's relationship. Henry James described her as the admirable, the infinitely civilized Lizzie. A widower, Francis Booth was wholly dedicated to his only daughter's education and raised her in a hillside villa in Florence. Frank Duveneck returned to Europe in 1877, this time to Poling, Bavaria. But Elizabeth Booth, encouraged by William Morris Hunt, had asked to study with Duveneck. So he agreed to make visits back to Munich to tutor the heiress. The highest compliment to Duveneck's teaching was the Duveneck boys, who gained notoriety as they, pictured here with a group of women students recruited by Lizzie, faithfully followed their teacher, sharing models. Here is Duveneck's painting entitled Turkish Page, and here is that of his student, William Merritt Chase. And posing for each other, here is Duveneck's portrait of student John White Alexander, and here is William Merritt Chase's portrait of Duveneck working. In Bavaria, Duveneck began painting en plein air landscapes for the first time. Soon he would take the Duveneck boys to Italy at the urging of Lizzie, to Florence, and to Venice, where they cavorted with James Whistler. In Italy, Duveneck struggled with a new style, vivid and intentional depictions of the local people, the contadini. But light poured into these new works. His paintings lost the old master's blacks completely, and his legendary brushwork veered towards that of Cézanne. Elizabeth Booth and Frank Duveneck would spend almost 9 years managing the electricity of their relationship, to her father's and Henry James' disapproval. It is speculated that James was also interested in marrying Lizzie. The daughter adored her father and did not want to upset him, but she also could not resist Duveneck. They finally married in Paris in 1886. Lizzie wrote to a friend, "It has been a long affair for years. The thing was given up entirely at one time, but on meeting again, we find that the old feeling is not dead, and we are going to take up life together, as we did not like it very well apart." Almost a year later, Lizzie gave birth to Frank Booth Duveneck Jr. This drawing and others are from her sketchbook. In March of 1888, the Paris Salon accepted Frank Duveneck's portrait of Lizzie, completed that year. But then, horrifically, just days later, Lizzie died of pneumonia on their second wedding anniversary. Lizzie had written these words about her husband and father. "What a strange fate to have lived long enough simply to tie those two men with nothing in common together by my miserable infant." Duveneck and his father-in-law actually bonded over their grief and the little boy, whom they both loved. It was decided that Lizzie's aunt and uncle, with an estate outside of Boston, would raise Frankie Jr. Duveneck was not allowed to bring his son to Cincinnati, where the grieving father immediately immersed himself in teaching again, until the child was 21. But Francis Booth did allow his son-in-law to inherit his daughter's fortune, denied when they were first married, making Duveneck a wealthy widower. But friends say he never recovered from the loss of Lizzie. In 1890, 2 years after her death, Duveneck came to Gloucester, perhaps for the first time. Close proximity to Frankie Jr. in Massachusetts made Gloucester the ideal summer situation for Duveneck. In 1893, he rented the old Niles farm on Eastern Point for father and son with his nurse to summer together. Duveneck returned to Gloucester 15 more years, often with his son, keeping 2 studios, one for morning light and one for evening. and he invited many of his old friends, some were Duveneck boys, to come work with him in Gloucester. John Henry Twachtman, Theodore Wendell, Willard Leroy Metcalf, and Child Hassam were some who came to be with Duveneck, often painting the same view beside each other. As curator Martha Oakes from the Cape Ann Museum notes, these works by Duveneck and renowned friends, this one by Edward Pothast, are what truly established Cape Ann as an important destination for serious artists. And these works, this by Duveneck, are some of the most important in American Impressionism. Art historian Adele de Cruz attests that Duveneck was also in this time seriously exploring the planes and color, the abstraction versus realism of modernism, the movement that took over the 20th century. Duveneck left his entire archive and collection up until Lizzie's death to the Cincinnati Art Museum. He never exhibited his Gloucester works. This may explain why Duveneck's reputation seems to have dimmed through the lens of history. Duveneck's will to exhibit had never been strong. He had always given works away, particularly to his students. He famously refused to sell a painting off an easel in Gloucester because he said he had to prove to his friends that he had worked that day. While the Gloucester work remained private, the awards and accolades continued in his life. The Metropolitan Museum of Art acquired a version of Duveneck's sculptural tribute to his wife, about which the sculptor Daniel Chester French said, "I have seldom been so moved and impressed by a work of art." And Duveneck made certain there would be a version in Boston's Museum of Fine Arts, so that his father-in-law, then in Cambridge, and his son could visit. In 1915, Duveneck was awarded a special gold medal for his achievement at the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco. Duveneck's genius was established when, at a London dinner party, John Singer Sargent was quoted as saying, "When all is said and done, Frank Duveneck is the greatest talent of the brush of this generation." In his last years, Duveneck painted a mural dedicated to his mother for the Cathedral Basilica of the Assumption in Covington, Kentucky, the first and the last coordinate on the map of Frank Duveneck's life. He died in Kentucky in 1919. Duveneck's career had begun in Europe with the darkest paintings and ended with those most filled with light on Cape Ann. Some of his last paintings were of Brace's Rocks off Eastern Point. A critic notes that Gloucester maritime painter Fitzhenry Lane also chose these rocks for his final paintings. Duveneck did not see the Gloucester paintings as exhibition material. He saved them as memories of the summers with his son, to whom he left them all. The coordinates of Frank Duveneck's life map a beloved man, a brilliant and generous teacher, and an extraordinary artist.